Hey guys, Mark here from MacBTV and welcome to my first ever video. And in this video I want to talk all about how to build the gaming PC. So if you don't know how to start or what components you're going to need, then stay tuned because we're going to talk all about that one in this video. Hey again, so I'm quite new on the gaming PC world, but I do have like a little bit of background about computers since I did take a computer-related course way back in college. But I'm still actually quite way behind on the technology, especially on the gaming category. So I had to actually know a lot of stuff first before I was able to actually build my own gaming PC. That's what I'm actually hoping to share with you in this video on what are the components that I had to know in order for me to build a gaming PC. And hopefully I can give you like a quick run through on those components and what are the things that you might need to consider in order for you to choose that component. So let's begin. So let's start off with the brains of the computer, which is your CPU or the processor. It is one of the most impactful part on your build, so choosing the right CPU is critical for your build. Currently you have two manufacturers that you can select from, which is Intel and AMD. Here are the things that you'll actually need to consider when it comes to your CPU. First thing is your specification, like the number of cores, its frequency, how much cache, and its features like overclocking capabilities if you want to overclock your system. And here's another thing we need to consider is your thermal design, because all processing units, including your CPU and your GPU, will generate heat. And knowing the thermal design or how much heat it will generate will give you an idea on like what type or what type of cooling system that you will probably need on your build. And lastly, what you're going to consider what you need to consider is your integrated graphics. If your CPU has like an integrated graphics, because if it has, then your GPU would probably become optional for this one. One of the reasons probably you would choose a CPU with an integrated graphics on it is probably would be like budget restrictions, because GPU would be the most or one of the most expensive part on your build. So if you don't currently have the budget for a GPU for a separate or a dedicated GPU, then yeah, go with a processor that has integrated graphics, because you'll still be able to get a display on your build even without the GPU. Next one up is the motherboard. The motherboard houses all the components, or it is where all the components is connected to. First thing you'll need to consider is its compatibility with the processor, because not all motherboards is compatible with the processor that you have already selected or you have chosen. And in addition to that, you need to also check if it supports your processor out of the box, because there are some motherboards that came before the release of that certain processor, and what you'll need to actually do is update the BIOS first before it supports the processor. So if you don't know how to update the BIOS without the operating system, then I'll probably stick with the motherboards that supports your processor out of the box. Another thing to consider when it comes to the motherboard is the size of the motherboard, because the larger the motherboard is, the more room for expansion you will have. So here are the size of the motherboards. First one, we have the Mini ITX, the smallest of the motherboards. You have the Micro ATX or M80X, the ATX, and the Extended ATX. Again, the larger the motherboard is, the more room you will have for expansion, because you will probably have additional slots, unlike the smaller motherboards, which only has like the limited slots. For one of this example is the DIMM slots. Some of the smaller motherboards only have like 2 DIMM slots, while others have like 4 or more. So the third component is your chassis or your case. The first thing you need to consider would be the size of the case, but it would depend on the size of motherboard that you have selected. So here are the types of cases that you can select from. So first is you have the small cases, which is the Mini ITX, M80X Mini Tower, and the standard cases like the Mid Tower, which fits the ATX motherboards, and we have the large cases, which is the Full Tower and the Super Towers, which fit the um, the EATX motherboards. And here are the other things that you will probably need to consider when it comes to the case. Is first is the airflow. Make sure that the case has proper ventilation, especially when it comes to cooling. Second would be the openings, especially when you will be installing a liquid cooling system. You probably would need enough space or openings for that, or for you to mount the cooling systems. Third would be the cable management. Make sure that the case has proper compartments or design in order for you to have an efficient cable management, because that would also affect, one is the airflow of the system, and also it would affect the design of your case. If you have like a theme, if you have like going for a simplistic design, then probably a like loose wires or wires following all around the inside the system will probably affect that design. The next one we have is the RAM, or the memory. It is probably the most easiest part to upgrade when it comes to your build. The first thing you need to consider when it comes to the RAM is the DDR generation, though you don't really need to worry that much when it comes to the DDR generation, since most or not all new motherboards already supports the DDR4 generation. But knowing the DDR generation would probably avoid compatibility issues, since only one type of memory is supported by a motherboard. Another thing to consider would be the DIMM slots, or the number of slots, the memory slots that your motherboard has. Since there are smaller motherboards that only have two RAM slots, while other larger motherboards have 4 or more slots available. Next one would be to consider is how much RAM you will need. For entry-level gaming, sweet spot would probably be the 8 gig of RAM. But if you're running like high-end application, more processing, and running like multiple applications at the same time as well, you will probably need more than that 8 gig of RAM. Another thing to consider is the frequency. It needs to be compatible with the CPU. Though it's your motherboard that specifies the lowest or the requirement frequency and the limit or the max frequency, but the specification would actually depend on the processor as well that you have that you have chosen, or you have installed on your build. Lastly, with the RAM, what you'll need to consider is if the motherboard supports a dual channel technology. Because if for the dual channel, instead of waiting for the first RAM to be fully used up, and using the second RAM, it will use both RAMs at the same time, utilizing their processing power at the same time as well, giving you more efficiency and probably improve the performance of your system. For you to utilize a dual channel, you need to actually use the 2 DIMM slots. So instead of purchasing like one 16 gig stick of RAM, to utilize the dual channel, you will need 2 8 gig of RAM plugged into the specific port on specific DIMM slots to activate or to utilize the dual channel. After the RAM, we have is the hard drive. The hard drive is the storage device where your operating system or your files are stored. There is currently a new technology or a new version of storage device already available aside from the hard drive, but I have listed it separately here on the list. I'll tell you why later. The minimum, or probably I would recommend at least a terabyte of storage capacity when it comes to the hard drive, since if you checked out like the latest games today, it actually takes up a lot of storage capacity. So if you want to have that sufficient gaming library, you probably need that much space of storage capacity available. So the next one we have is the power supply. The power supply will distribute the power to the rest of your components. The first thing you'll need to actually consider when it comes to the power supply is the power and its efficiency rating. For entry level build, you probably would need at least a 400-watt power supply. It would be sufficient enough to power up your PC or your computer. But if you're going to actually add more devices, because it will depend on devices you'll actually install. If you install like several hard drives, like multiple hard drives and additional GPUs or video cards, then probably you would need more than the 400 watts power supply. Another thing to consider as well when it comes to the power supply is its cabling. You have two types of power supply currently. You have the hardwired and the modular. The hardwired power supply is where the cable is integrated to the power supply unit and can't be removed, while modular power supply has the cable come separately, which will actually give you more efficiency when it comes to the cable management, since you'll only need to plug in the cables that you'll actually require or need. Lastly, the power supply needs to come from a reputable manufacturer. If your power supply is faulty, it will probably damage the rest of the components of your computer. After the power supply, you will need to choose the operating system. Currently, you have Windows as the most popular operating system currently used today. You can also go with an open source operating system, which with one example is Linux. But if you're an end user like me, I'll probably stick with Windows. Another port we have here is the solid state drive. This is actually the newer version of the storage device that I was referring to earlier when we talk about the hard drive. The reason why I have this separately listed is because some users actually use both solid state drive and hard drive on their build. The reason for that is solid state drive is actually much more expensive than the hard drive. So you, instead of purchasing like a large capacity solid state drive, they actually purchase like small capacity solid state drive and purchase a large capacity hard drive. So they actually use the solid state drive to install their operating system and the frequently used application and the hard drive for their storage or for their files and actually where they install their games. The reason for this one is since the solid state drive is significantly much faster than the hard drive, and when you install the operating system on the solid state drive, it will give you like significant improvement when it comes to performance. There are a couple of types of solid state drives that you'll need to actually consider for this. First one is we have the SATA solid state drive. It is the same port where the hard drive is plugged in using a SATA cable as well. Well, the M.2 is actually plugged in directly to the motherboard, which is actually much faster than the SATA type solid state drive. So the next part is one of the most impactful components on your build when it comes to performance, and that is your GPU or your graphics processing unit. The first thing you'll need to consider actually is the size of your GPU, because you want to make sure that it would fit your case or chassis. Next thing to consider is the specification. For example, if you'd like to attain that 4K resolution, probably you would need a memory amount of 8 gigabytes. Another thing to consider when it comes to specification is your power connectors. Make sure that you have available power connectors in the power supply to power up your GPU. Another thing is the ports available on your GPU so that you'll be able to connect your monitor that you are using to your GPU, or because if it's not available, then you probably would end up purchasing an adapter to make it work. Another thing to consider as well is your monitor. To attain that resolution, you need to have that powerful GPU, as well as the refresh rate needs to match as well with the monitor, because if you don't have like a high refresh rate on your monitor, and your GPU would actually be pushing pixels faster than the monitor can keep up, then you will have actually an issue with that one. Probably would have like a delay on the display. There are a couple of specifications as well that you need to consider, like the clock speed or memory speed. Lastly, what you need to consider when it comes to your GPU is actually your design. Make sure that it does fit, or actually it goes with the design that, or the theme that you're actually set for your build, since you do actually have like a lot of variety of designs for your GPU, since Nvidia and AMD does sell their GPUs to third-party companies to design them on their own. So next up, we have the cooling system. So for the cooling system, you'll actually need this one to keep your GPU and your CPU cool. Currently, we have two types of cooling systems. We have the air cooling and the liquid cooling. Liquid cooling is probably the offers the most when it comes to heat dissipation, since liquid does transfer heat efficiently than air, though liquid cooling is probably much more expensive and probably would take much space on your case. So we're actually down to the one last item on the list, which is your RGB lights. It does not have any impact at all when it comes to performance, but it does have an impact on the design if you know actually how to use it. But if you're on a budget restriction, then probably you need to skip on the RGB lights, since it does not have any impact at all on the performance. That's it for the 11 components that you're actually going to need in order for you to build a gaming PC. And hopefully this video helped you to get you started on those components to help you build that gaming PC that you've always wanted. And in case you're still having issues or trouble, you can always message me on my Facebook page, which is MacBTV, or you can always go for a pre-built system. That would be much easier as well. There's always that option. And if you have learned a lot, please do like this video, hit the subscribe button, and click that notification bell so you'll be updated on my latest videos. I'll see you on the next one. Adios.